The temperature gauge in Pasadena, Texas read 94 degrees on August 8, 1973, but inside 2020, Lamar Drive, something far more sinister than the summer heat, was creating an unbearable stench. Neighbors had been complaining for weeks about the smell, a putrid, sweet odor that seemed to seep through the walls of the modest white frame house. They assumed it was a dead animal, maybe a possum that had crawled under the porch to die. They had no idea they were smelling the decomposing remains of at least 27 young men and boys. By sunrise that humid August morning, the Houston Police Department would uncover what would become known as the most horrific mass murder case in American history at that time. But this wasn't just another crime story. This was the unmasking of a monster who had been hiding in plain sight for over 3 years, operating a systematic killing machine while the community slept soundly, trusting that their children were safe. Dean Corll had earned the nickname the Candy Man from local kids who flocked to his family's candy factory for free samples. Parents saw him as generous, maybe a little odd, but harmless. What they didn't know was that behind his friendly smile and gift of sweets lay the mind of one of America's most prolific serial killers, a man who would torture, rape, and murder at least 28 young victims, with the help of 2 teenage accomplices who lured their own friends to their deaths. The story begins not with Dean Corll's first kill, but with his last breath, gasping for air as 17-year-old Elmer Henley stood over him with a smoking .22 caliber pistol, finally ending a reign of terror that had consumed Houston's youth for years. But even in death, Corll's true horror was just beginning to emerge from the shadows. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. The house at 2020 Lamar Drive looked ordinary enough from the street. Single story, white paint peeling slightly in the Texas sun, a small front yard with struggling grass. It was the kind of place you'd drive past without a second glance, never imagining that behind those walls, a torture chamber had been meticulously constructed. Never suspecting that beneath floorboards and buried in nearby locations lay the remains of dozens of young men whose families still waited for them to come home. When Henley called the police that morning, his voice shaking as he confessed to killing Dean Corll in what he claimed was self-defense, he had no idea he was about to expose the largest murder investigation in Houston's history. As officers arrived at the scene, they found more than just Corll's body. They discovered a house of horrors that would haunt investigators for decades to come. The smell that neighbors had been complaining about wasn't coming from a dead animal. It was the scent of human decomposition, seeping through the floorboards where lime had been scattered in a desperate attempt to mask the evidence of Dean Corll's unspeakable crimes. As police began to process the scene, they realized they weren't just looking at a single homicide. They were standing at ground zero of a mass murder spree that had been operating under their noses for years. But how does a man become a monster? How does a community fail so catastrophically to protect its children? And how do teenage boys become willing participants in the systematic murder of their own peers? The answers to these questions lie buried not just in the sandy soil of Houston's outskirts, but in a twisted tale of manipulation, abuse, and a justice system that would ultimately fail the victims, even in death. This is the story of the Icebox Murders, named for the boat storage shed where many of the bodies were discovered, preserved in the Texas heat like specimens in a grotesque museum. It's the story of Dean Corll, Elmer Henley, and David Owen Brooks. But most importantly, it's the story of 28 young men whose lives were cut short, whose families deserved answers, and whose memories demand that this horror never be forgotten. To understand how Dean Corll became one of America's most prolific serial killers, you have to start with a family business built on sweetness and deception. The Corll Candy Company wasn't just a modest confectionery operation in Houston's Heights neighborhood. It was the perfect cover for a predator learning to hunt. Born on Christmas Eve, 1939, Dean Corll seemed destined for a life of contradictions. His mother, Mary Robinson, was a domineering woman who would marry and divorce multiple times, dragging young Dean through a series of unstable households. His father, Arnold Edwin Corll, was largely absent, leaving Dean to navigate his formative years under the iron fist of a mother who demanded perfection while providing little emotional warmth. The candy company began as Mary's dream in the early 1950s. She had visions of building a confectionery empire, starting small with pecan pralines and divinity candy made in their home kitchen. Dean, then in his teens, became his mother's reluctant business partner, spending countless hours after school stirring boiling sugar, dipping chocolates, and packaging sweets for local distribution. But even in those early days, neighbors noticed something unsettling about the quiet teenager who worked alongside his mother. Dean rarely spoke unless spoken to, maintaining an almost robotic efficiency as he performed his tasks. He seemed to watch the neighborhood children with an intensity that made some parents uncomfortable, though they couldn't quite articulate why. By 1963, the Corll Candy Company had grown substantial enough to warrant its own facility. Mary leased a small building at 505 West 22nd Street in Houston Heights, and Dean took on increasing responsibilities in the operation. This was when local children first began referring to him as the Candy Man, a nickname that would take on sinister meaning in the years to come. The factory became Dean's kingdom. While his mother handled the business side, Dean controlled the production floor, the inventory, and most importantly, the interaction with customers. Children would stop by after school, drawn by the sweet aromas wafting from the building and Dean's seemingly generous nature. He would hand out free samples, engage them in conversation, and gradually build relationships that their parents viewed as harmless community interaction. What these parents didn't realize was that Dean Corll was methodically studying their children, learning their schedules, their habits, their vulnerabilities. He memorized which kids walked home alone, which ones came from troubled households, which ones were desperate for adult attention and approval. The candy factory wasn't just producing confections, it was serving as a recruitment center for victims. Dean's personal life during this period remained largely mysterious to those around him. He had no romantic relationships that anyone could identify, no close friends, no hobbies beyond his work at the factory. He lived with his mother in a series of rented houses, always maintaining the facade of the dutiful son while privately developing the sadistic fantasies that would eventually consume him. The business thrived through the mid-1960s, but cracks began to show in the family dynamic. Mary remarried again, this time to a traveling salesman named Jake West, and the couple decided to relocate to Colorado to expand their candy operation. Dean, now in his mid-20s, was expected to close the Houston facility and follow his mother to their new venture. But Dean had other plans. Houston had become his hunting ground, and he wasn't ready to leave. In 1965, he made the decision that would ultimately seal his fate and the fate of 28 young victims. He stayed behind, ostensibly to wrap up the business affairs, but in reality to begin the most horrific killing spree in Texas history. The Corll Candy Company officially closed its doors in 1968, but Dean continued using the building sporadically, maintaining the key and using it as one of several locations where he would bring his victims. The sweet smell of candy production was replaced by the acrid scent of lime and death, as Dean transformed his mother's dream into his own personal nightmare factory. By this time, Dean had already claimed his first victims, though their disappearances hadn't yet been connected to the friendly candy man who had once handed out free samples to neighborhood children. He had learned to perfect his facade, appearing to be nothing more than a quiet, somewhat awkward man who worked odd jobs around Houston while living in a series of unremarkable rental properties. The foundation for horror had been laid, built on a bedrock of family dysfunction, social isolation, and a business that provided perfect cover for predatory behavior. Dean Corll was no longer just making candy. He was crafting the perfect trap for Houston's most vulnerable young people. After his mother's departure to Colorado in 1968, Dean Corll underwent a transformation that would unleash one of the most methodical killing machines in criminal history. Free from maternal oversight for the first time in his adult life, the 28-year-old former candy maker began exploring the darkest corners of his psyche with deadly results. Corll's first documented kill occurred in September 1970, though investigators would later suspect he had been experimenting with violence for months before that. His victim was 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan, a University of Texas student who had been hitchhiking near downtown Houston. Conan's disappearance barely registered with authorities, just another college kid who probably ran off with friends or dropped out of school. No one connected the missing student to the quiet man living alone in a rented house on Yorktown Street. What made Corll particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize his life into seemingly normal routines while developing increasingly sophisticated methods of luring, controlling, and disposing of victims. By day, he worked various jobs, as an electrician, in construction, at a medical supply company, maintaining professional relationships and earning the respect of his supervisors. By night, he trolled Houston's neighborhoods, studying potential victims with the patience of a seasoned hunter. Corll's psychological profile revealed a man driven by an insatiable need for complete domination. Unlike killers who strike in moments of rage or passion, Corll planned each abduction with meticulous detail. He studied his victims for weeks, learning their patterns, their vulnerabilities, their social connections. He identified young men who were isolated, troubled, or seeking acceptance, boys who wouldn't be immediately missed if they disappeared. The torture chamber he constructed at 2020 Lamar Drive reflected this methodical approach. The back bedroom had been converted into a soundproofed killing room, complete with a specially constructed plywood board fitted with handcuffs and restraints. The walls were covered with plastic sheeting to contain blood splatter, and the floor had been reinforced to support the weight of his victims during prolonged torture sessions that could last for hours or even days. Corll's methods evolved through experimentation and refinement. Early victims were killed relatively quickly, but as his confidence grew, so did the duration and sophistication of his torture techniques. He developed a ritualistic approach to his crimes, following specific patterns of abduction, torture, sexual assault, and murder that satisfied his psychological needs while minimizing his risk of detection. What distinguished Corll from other serial killers was his recruitment of accomplices, teenage boys who would eventually become integral to his operation. In 1969, he met 12-year-old David Owen Brooks, a troubled kid from a broken home who was desperate for adult attention and approval. Corll began grooming Brooks slowly, providing him with money, drugs, and a sense of belonging that the boy had never experienced. Brooks later testified that Corll initially presented himself as a mentor and friend, someone who understood the difficulties of growing up in a harsh world. The relationship began with seemingly innocent activities, watching television, sharing meals, casual conversation about Brooks's problems at home and school. Corll was patient, allowing trust to build naturally while carefully observing Brooks's psychological makeup. The grooming process took months, with Corll gradually introducing more inappropriate elements into their relationship. He provided Brooks with marijuana and alcohol, creating a sense of shared rebellion against adult authority. He offered money for small tasks, establishing a transactional dynamic that would prove crucial to his later recruitment efforts. By early 1970, Brooks had become completely dependent on Corll's approval and financial support. When Corll finally revealed his true nature, showing Brooks evidence of his crimes and threatening to make him the next victim, the teenager found himself trapped in a web of complicity from which escape seemed impossible. Brooks's recruitment marked a turning point in Corll's evolution as a killer. No longer operating alone, he now had access to victims through Brooks's social connections and the teenager's ability to move freely through Houston's youth culture without arousing suspicion. Brooks could approach potential victims as a peer, gaining their trust in ways that Corll, now in his 30s, could no longer accomplish on his own. The partnership between predator and accomplice created a feedback loop of escalating violence. Corll's confidence grew with each successful abduction, while Brooks became increasingly numb to the horror surrounding him, rationalizing his participation as necessary for survival. Together, they refined their techniques, developing more sophisticated methods of luring victims and disposing of evidence. By 1971, Dean Corll had transformed from a struggling former candy maker into Houston's most prolific serial killer, operating with mechanical efficiency and the enthusiastic assistance of a teenage accomplice who had been molded into the perfect hunting companion. In the summer of 1971, something sinister was happening to Houston's teenage boys, but nobody seemed to notice. One by one, young men were vanishing from the city's neighborhoods, not in dramatic fashion that would capture headlines, but quietly, like smoke dissipating in the Texas heat. Their disappearances followed a pattern that would only become clear in hindsight. They were all vulnerable, all seeking acceptance, and all unfortunate enough to cross paths with Dean Corll's expanding network of death. The Houston Police Department's missing persons files from this period tell a story of systematic neglect and willful blindness. When 14-year-old Donald Waldrop disappeared in January 1971, officers noted his history of running away and classified him as another teenage runaway. When 15-year-old Jerry Waldrop, Donald's younger brother, vanished just days later, police assumed the brothers had simply run off together. The possibility that both boys might have been murdered never seriously entered the investigation. This pattern of dismissal became the norm rather than the exception. 13-year-old David Hilligius disappeared in May 1971 after telling his parents he was going swimming with friends. Police reports describe him as probably a runaway, despite his family's insistence that David had never shown any inclination to leave home. When his friend Gregory Malleywinkle, also 13, vanished the same day, investigators concluded the boys had likely run away together rather than considering more sinister possibilities. What made these disappearances particularly tragic was how easily they could have been prevented if authorities had recognized the emerging pattern. The missing boys shared several key characteristics. They were between 13 and 20 years old, came from working-class families, and had some history of behavioral problems or family instability that made them easy to dismiss as voluntary runaways. Corll and Brooks had identified this demographic deliberately. They understood that society's most vulnerable children were also its most overlooked. A middle-class teenager from a stable home who disappeared would generate intense police attention and media coverage. But a troubled kid from a broken family? His absence might not even be reported for days, and when it was, investigators would assume he had simply chosen to leave. The selection process was methodical and cold-blooded. Corll would identify potential victims through observation and research, studying their daily routines and social connections. Brooks served as his eyes and ears within Houston's teenage community, reporting back on which boys might be susceptible to recruitment. They looked for specific indicators: boys who walked alone, who seemed isolated from peer groups, who displayed signs of depression or anger, who might be easily impressed by the attention of older teenagers or adults. Once a target was selected, the grooming process could take weeks or even months. Corll understood that successful predation required patience and careful cultivation of trust. He would arrange seemingly accidental encounters, gradually building relationships that appeared innocent to outside observers. He might offer rides, small gifts, or invitations to parties where drugs and alcohol were freely available. The luring techniques became increasingly sophisticated as Corll's confidence grew. Sometimes Brooks would approach potential victims directly, presenting himself as a peer who could introduce them to exciting new experiences. Other times, Corll would use his adult status to appeal to boys seeking father figures or mentors. He became expert at identifying what each potential victim most desired: acceptance, excitement, money, drugs, and positioning himself as the provider of those needs. The geographic pattern of disappearances also revealed Corll's strategic thinking. Rather than focusing on a single neighborhood where multiple missing persons might raise suspicions, he cast his net across Houston's sprawling metropolitan area. Boys disappeared from the Heights, from Pasadena, from Southwest Houston, creating a scattered pattern that prevented investigators from recognizing the connections. By late 1971, the missing persons reports were accumulating at an alarming rate, but Houston police maintained their stance that these were isolated runaway cases. Department policy seemed designed to minimize investigation rather than maximize the chances of finding missing children. Officers were encouraged to close cases quickly, moving on to what were considered more serious crimes that actually had victims, as if missing children weren't victims deserving of serious attention. The families of the missing boys found themselves fighting not just for answers, but for the basic acknowledgement that their children mattered. Parents like Alton and Betty Hilligius, whose son David had vanished without a trace, spent their own money printing flyers and conducting searches that police should have organized. They haunted the missing persons department, demanding updates on investigations that had essentially been abandoned within days of the initial reports. What these desperate families didn't know was that their children weren't runaways at all. They were victims of the most systematic killing spree in Texas history, their bodies already buried in locations around Houston, while police continued to classify them as voluntary disappearances. The recruitment of Elmer Wayne Henley in August 1971 marked the evolution of Dean Corll's operation from a one-man killing machine into a sophisticated network of predation that would claim over 24 lives. Unlike David Brooks, whose compliance had been secured through gradual manipulation and fear, Henley's indoctrination into Corll's world of horror would prove far more complex and ultimately more volatile. Henley was 15 years old when he first encountered Corll through Brooks, who had been tasked with expanding their victim pool by bringing new boys into Corll's orbit. Henley came from the kind of broken home that Corll specifically targeted. His father had abandoned the family when Henley was young, leaving his mother Mary to raise 4 children on a secretary's salary. The teenager was angry, desperate for money, and hungry for the kind of male attention he had never received from his absent father. What made Henley different from Brooks was his intelligence and natural leadership qualities. Where Brooks was compliant and passive, content to follow orders without question, Henley possessed a sharp mind and an independent streak that both impressed and concerned Corll. The older man recognized that Henley could be a valuable asset, but also sensed that his new recruit might eventually pose a threat to the carefully controlled dynamic he had established. Corll's recruitment of Henley followed a predictable pattern, but with subtle differences that reflected his growing confidence and expertise in manipulation. He began by offering the teenager money for small tasks, delivering packages, running errands, helping with odd jobs around his various rental properties. The payments were generous by teenage standards, often $50 or $100 for work that should have paid minimum wage. As trust developed, Corll gradually introduced Henley to his world of drugs, alcohol, and sexual experimentation. He hosted parties at his homes where teenage boys could drink freely and experiment with marijuana and pills, creating an environment that felt rebellious and adult. For kids like Henley, who had little supervision at home and limited financial resources, these gatherings represented everything they thought they wanted: freedom, excitement, and acceptance from an adult who seemed to understand their frustrations. The transformation from party host to predator happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. Corll would identify boys at these gatherings who were particularly vulnerable, those who drank too much, those who seemed isolated even within the group, those who displayed signs of emotional instability. He would arrange private conversations with these potential victims, offering them special attention and privileges that set them apart from the others. By early 1972, both Brooks and Henley were fully aware of Corll's homicidal activities, though their levels of direct participation varied. Brooks had been present for multiple murders and had helped dispose of bodies, making him a full accomplice in the legal sense. Henley's involvement began more gradually, with Corll initially using him primarily for victim recruitment while keeping him somewhat insulated from the actual killing process. The financial arrangements between Corll and his accomplices revealed the transactional nature of their relationship. Brooks and Henley were paid for their services, typically $200 for each boy they successfully delivered to Corll. This payment system transformed friendship and peer relationships into commercial transactions, with teenagers literally selling their friends for cash. The psychological impact of this arrangement cannot be overstated. Both accomplices later described the internal struggle between their need for Corll's money and approval and their growing horror at what they were witnessing. Brooks dealt with this cognitive dissonance by retreating into denial and passive compliance, convincing himself that he was merely following orders from someone who would kill him if he refused. Henley's response was more complex and ultimately more dangerous to Corll's operation. The teenager began displaying signs of psychological stress, mood swings, increased drug use, and occasional expressions of guilt or remorse that concerned Corll. Unlike Brooks, who seemed content to remain a subordinate, Henley showed signs of wanting more control over their operations and more equality in his relationship with the older man. The dynamic between the 3 conspirators created a volatile triangle of mutual dependence and growing tension. Corll needed his accomplices to access victims and maintain his cover of normalcy. Brooks and Henley needed Corll's money and feared his retaliation if they tried to leave. But underneath this practical arrangement lay deeper psychological currents that would eventually destroy them all. By 1973, the partnership had claimed the lives of at least 26 young men, with bodies buried at multiple locations around Houston. The operation had become so routine that all three participants seemed to view it as simply another aspect of their daily lives. A horrific normalization of mass murder that allowed them to continue functioning in regular society while systematically destroying Houston's youth. But cracks were beginning to show in their carefully constructed facade, and the psychological pressure of maintaining such a massive deception was taking its toll on all three conspirators. The house at 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena appeared unremarkable from the outside, a modest single-story rental property in a working-class neighborhood where nobody asked too many questions about their neighbors. But behind its ordinary facade, Dean Corll had constructed what investigators would later describe as one of the most sophisticated torture chambers in American criminal history, a purpose-built facility designed for prolonged suffering and systematic murder. Corll had rented the property in late 1972, specifically selecting it for its isolation and structural features that would serve his deadly purposes. The house sat on a large lot with mature trees that provided natural screening from neighboring properties. More importantly, it had a detached garage and a layout that allowed him to modify the interior without attracting unwanted attention from landlords or visitors. The centerpiece of Corll's operation was the back bedroom, which he had converted into a soundproofed killing chamber through months of careful preparation. The walls had been covered with thick plastic sheeting and additional insulation to muffle screams and prevent blood from seeping through to adjacent rooms. The windows were permanently sealed and covered with heavy curtains, ensuring that no light would escape to alert neighbors to activities inside. At the center of this room stood Corll's most chilling creation, a specially constructed plywood torture board measuring 8 feet long and 2 feet wide. The board was equipped with handcuffs and leather restraints at precise intervals, designed to immobilize victims in positions that would maximize their suffering while preventing any possibility of escape. The craftsmanship was meticulous, revealing the care and planning Corll invested in perfecting his methods of control. Surrounding the torture board was an array of implements that investigators would catalog with growing horror during their eventual search of the property. Corll had assembled a collection of tools designed specifically for inflicting pain: knives of various sizes, pliers, electrical devices for shock torture, and chemicals that could cause excruciating burns without immediately killing his victims. Each item had been carefully selected and tested, representing months or years of experimentation in the art of human suffering. The floor of the torture chamber had been reinforced and covered with multiple layers of plastic and canvas that could be easily cleaned and replaced. Corll had installed industrial-strength ventilation fans to manage odors and maintain air circulation during his prolonged torture sessions. These modifications revealed a level of technical sophistication that went far beyond the impulses of a spontaneous killer. This was the workshop of a man who had turned murder into a methodical craft. Adjacent to the main torture chamber, Corll had established what amounted to a body preparation facility. This smaller room contained lime for accelerating decomposition, plastic sheeting for wrapping remains, and tools for dismemberment when necessary. The clinical organization of these materials suggested that Corll had developed standardized procedures for handling his victims from initial capture through final disposal. The basement of the property served as temporary storage for bodies that couldn't be immediately transported to burial sites. Corll had excavated sections of the basement floor, creating shallow graves where victims could be kept until he was ready to move them to more permanent locations. The lime scattered throughout these areas created a caustic environment that accelerated decomposition while attempting to control the overwhelming stench of death. What made the Lamar Drive facility particularly horrifying was the evidence it contained of Corll's evolving techniques and increasing sophistication. Early victims had been killed relatively quickly, but as his confidence and sadistic appetites grew, the torture sessions became longer and more elaborate. Physical evidence suggested that some victims had been kept alive for days, subjected to repeated assaults and torture before finally being allowed to die. The house also served as headquarters for Corll's recruitment operations. He maintained detailed notes on potential victims, including their daily routines, family situations, and psychological vulnerabilities. These files revealed the systematic nature of his hunting, with victims being studied and stalked for weeks before being lured to their deaths. Brooks and Henley later testified about the routine nature of activities at the Lamar Drive house. describing how they had become desensitized to the horrors surrounding them. They spoke of watching television in the living room while victims were being tortured in the back bedroom, of sharing meals at the kitchen table while bodies decomposed beneath their feet, of the casual conversations about disposal methods and burial locations that had become part of their daily lives. The psychological impact of the torture chamber extended beyond its immediate victims to encompass everyone who participated in or witnessed its horrors. Both accomplices described feeling trapped in a nightmare from which they couldn't escape, bound to Corll by their own complicity and their fear of becoming his next victims if they tried to leave. By August 1973, the house at 2020 Lamar Drive had become the epicenter of the largest mass murder operation in American history, a factory of death that had claimed at least 27 lives while operating completely undetected by law enforcement or the surrounding community. By 1973, Dean Corll's operation had evolved into a sophisticated hunting network that extended far beyond the confines of his torture chamber. What made his killing spree so devastatingly effective wasn't just his own predatory skills, but his ability to manipulate an entire web of unwitting accomplices, teenagers, parents, and even law enforcement officials who inadvertently helped sustain his reign of terror through willful blindness and systemic negligence. The recruitment system that Corll had perfected with Brooks and Henley created a self-perpetuating cycle of victimization. Each new accomplice brought with them a fresh network of potential victims, friends, acquaintances, and social connections who could be approached without suspicion. This exponential expansion of his hunting ground allowed Corll to maintain a steady supply of victims while minimizing his own direct exposure to risk. Henley had proven particularly valuable in this regard, possessing a natural charisma and street credibility that allowed him to move easily between different social groups. Unlike Brooks, who operated primarily within his immediate circle of troubled friends, Henley could approach victims from across Houston's teenage social spectrum. He understood instinctively which boys might be vulnerable to their recruitment tactics and which approach would be most effective for each individual target. The luring process had become refined to an art form by this point. Corll and his accomplices had identified several reliable methods for drawing victims to the Lamar Drive house. Sometimes they would offer jobs, construction work, moving furniture, helping with odd tasks that would appeal to teenagers looking for quick money. Other times they would promise parties with free drugs and alcohol, appealing to boys seeking excitement and social acceptance. Perhaps most insidiously, they exploited the basic human desire for friendship and belonging. Many of their victims were isolated, lonely boys who were desperate for acceptance from what appeared to be a cool, older crowd. Corll understood that teenagers would often ignore obvious warning signs if they believed it meant gaining entry into a social group that would provide the approval and belonging they craved. The geographic spread of their operations had also become more sophisticated. Rather than concentrating on specific neighborhoods, they were pulling victims from across Houston's metropolitan area, Pasadena, the Heights, Southwest Houston, and even outlying communities. This dispersal made it virtually impossible for law enforcement to recognize patterns or connections between the disappearances. The complicity extended beyond the immediate conspirators to include a broader network of enablers who provided logistical support without fully understanding what they were facilitating. Corll had cultivated relationships with several adults who owned boats, had access to remote properties, or could provide transportation and equipment for body disposal. These individuals later claimed ignorance of his true activities, insisting they had simply been helping a friend with legitimate business needs. Even more troubling was the passive complicity of the broader Houston community, including parents who failed to ask hard questions about their children's new friends and activities. Many families were so grateful that their troubled teenagers seemed to have found positive adult mentors and stable peer groups that they didn't investigate too deeply into the specifics of these relationships. The Houston Police Department's handling of missing persons cases during this period represents perhaps the most damaging form of institutional complicity. By consistently classifying disappearances as runaways without conducting meaningful investigations, law enforcement essentially provided Corll with official cover for his activities. Each dismissive police report reinforced the narrative that these boys had chosen to leave, rather than suggesting they might be victims of foul play. This institutional blindness was compounded by socioeconomic bias that made certain victims more disposable than others in the eyes of authorities. Middle-class children from stable homes who disappeared generated intense police attention and media coverage. But working-class boys from troubled families were essentially written off as inevitable casualties of urban dysfunction, their disappearances treated as social problems rather than potential crimes. The psychological mechanisms that allowed this web of complicity to function revealed disturbing truths about human nature and social responsibility. Individuals who might have intervened remained silent, because speaking up would have required them to acknowledge uncomfortable realities about people they knew and communities they were part of. It was easier to maintain plausible deniability than to confront the possibility that something monstrous was happening in their midst. Corll himself had become expert at exploiting these psychological blind spots. He understood that people wanted to believe in the normalcy of their world and would actively resist information that challenged their comfortable assumptions. He presented himself as exactly what people expected to see: a quiet, somewhat odd man who kept to himself and caused no obvious trouble. By the summer of 1973, this web of complicity had enabled Corll to operate with virtual impunity for over 3 years, claiming at least 27 lives while maintaining his cover as a harmless eccentric. The system he had created seemed almost foolproof, sustainable indefinitely, as long as all participants continued playing their assigned roles. But complex systems built on deception and violence carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, and cracks were beginning to appear in the carefully constructed facade that had protected Houston's most prolific killer. The evening of August 7, 1973, began like countless others at 2020 Lamar Drive, with Dean Corll preparing for what he anticipated would be another routine night of torture and murder. He had already selected his victims: 15-year-old Rhonda Williams and 14-year-old Timothy Curley, two teenagers who represented a slight departure from his usual pattern of targeting only young men. What Corll didn't realize was that this deviation from his established methods would trigger a chain of events that would destroy him and expose the full horror of his 3-year killing spree. Elmer Henley had arranged the evening's activities, telling Williams and Curley that they were invited to a party where they could drink, smoke marijuana, and hang out with older kids. Both teenagers eagerly accepted the invitation. Williams was dating Henley and trusted him completely, while Curley was desperate to fit in with what he perceived as a sophisticated crowd. Neither had any reason to suspect that they were being delivered to their deaths. The group arrived at Corll's house around 9 p.m., finding the older man in an unusually agitated state. Corll had been drinking heavily and seemed more paranoid than usual, repeatedly checking the windows and expressing concerns about neighbors who might be watching the house. This nervousness should have been a warning sign, but the teenagers were focused on the promise of a fun evening and paid little attention to their host's behavior. As the night progressed, Corll provided his guests with alcohol and drugs, following his standard procedure for incapacitating potential victims. But something was different about this evening's dynamics. The presence of a female victim represented uncharted territory for Corll, whose fantasies and methods had been specifically developed around the torture and murder of young men. Williams's presence seemed to disrupt his psychological preparation and throw off his usual rhythm. More significantly, Henley was displaying signs of psychological strain that concerned Corll. The teenager had been showing increased resistance to participating in murders, expressing guilt about luring friends to their deaths, and questioning whether they should find other ways to make money. Corll had begun to suspect that his most valuable accomplice might be losing his nerve and becoming a liability to the operation. Around midnight, when all 3 teenagers had become sufficiently intoxicated, Corll made his move. Following his established pattern, he suggested a game that involved the victims allowing themselves to be handcuffed. Curley and Williams, in their impaired state, agreed to what they assumed was some kind of party game. But when Henley also found himself being restrained, he realized that something had gone terribly wrong. When the teenagers awakened hours later, they found themselves bound with handcuffs and rope in Corll's torture chamber. Corll stood over them with a knife, explaining in calm detail exactly what he intended to do to each of them. This was the moment when Henley finally understood the full scope of the horror he had been facilitating, not just as an abstract concept, but as an immediate personal reality. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms and analyzed by psychologists for decades. Corll made a fatal mistake in his psychological manipulation of Henley, believing that he could control his accomplice through the same combination of fear and dependency that had worked for years. Instead of immediately proceeding with his planned murders, Corll attempted to negotiate with Henley, offering to release Williams in exchange for his continued cooperation in killing Curley. This negotiation revealed the fundamental instability that had always existed beneath the surface of their partnership. Henley's relationship with Williams represented genuine human connection in a life that had been increasingly consumed by death and deception. When forced to choose between his loyalty to Corll and his feelings for Williams, something inside the 17-year-old snapped. The confrontation that followed was swift and decisive. Henley managed to convince Corll to release his restraints by promising to help with the murders, but instead of complying, he grabbed Corll's .22 caliber pistol and turned it on his tormentor. The first shot struck Corll in the forehead, killing him instantly and ending one of the most prolific killing sprees in American history. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, Henley found himself in a state of shock and confusion. The man who had dominated his life for nearly 2 years lay dead at his feet, but the full implications of what this meant were only beginning to sink in. Williams and Curley were still alive, witnesses to events that would inevitably lead to exposure of everything that had happened at the Lamar Drive house. At 6:08 a.m. on August 8, 1973, Henley made the phone call that would change everything. His voice shaking as he spoke to the Pasadena police dispatcher, he uttered the words that would finally bring justice for 27 murdered boys. "Y'all better come here right now. I just killed a man." The first police officers to arrive at 2020, Lamar Drive expected to process a routine homicide, one teenager who had killed an adult in what appeared to be a domestic dispute. What they discovered instead was the opening chapter of the largest mass murder investigation in American history, a horror story that would consume Houston law enforcement for months and shake the city's faith in its most basic institutions. Detective David Mulliken of the Pasadena Police Department was among the first responders, and his initial assessment of the scene revealed disturbing inconsistencies with Henley's claim of self-defense. The torture board in the back bedroom, the plastic sheeting covering the walls, the collection of restraints and weapons, none of this matched the story of a simple confrontation between an adult and teenager. As Mulliken and his colleagues processed the physical evidence, they began to realize they were looking at something far more sinister than a single homicide. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered lime scattered beneath the floorboards and the unmistakable odor of human decomposition permeating the house. Henley, faced with overwhelming physical evidence and the prospect of being charged with multiple murders, finally broke down and began revealing the truth about Dean Corll's killing spree. His confession, delivered in halting segments over several hours, painted a picture of systematic murder that initially seemed too horrific to believe. Houston Police Department officials were contacted immediately, and the investigation quickly expanded to involve multiple agencies and dozens of officers. Chief of Police Herman Short found himself managing not just a criminal investigation, but a public relations nightmare that threatened to expose years of negligent handling of missing persons cases. The department that had consistently dismissed worried parents and classified disappearances as runaways was now forced to confront the possibility that they had failed to protect dozens of Houston's children. Henley's initial confession provided investigators with 3 burial locations: a boat storage shed in southwest Houston, a beach house property near High Island, and the basement of the Lamar Drive house itself. Each location represented a different phase of Corll's evolution as a killer, with bodies buried in chronological layers that told the story of his increasing confidence and sophistication over 3 years of murder. The first excavation began at the boat storage shed on Silver Bell Street, where Henley claimed Corll had buried his earliest victims. The facility was owned by a man who had rented space to Corll for storing what he claimed were construction materials and personal belongings. The owner later insisted he had no knowledge of the true nature of what Corll was storing beneath the concrete floor of the shed. As officers began breaking through the concrete with jackhammers and shovels, the August heat made their gruesome task almost unbearable. The bodies they uncovered had been wrapped in plastic and covered with lime, but the Texas climate had accelerated decomposition to the point where identification would require extensive forensic work. Each discovery brought a mixture of horror and confirmation that Henley's confessions were accurate in their broad outlines, even if specific details remained unclear. The excavation at High Island began simultaneously, with a larger team of investigators working the sandy soil where Corll had buried his more recent victims. This location, near the Gulf Coast beaches popular with Houston families, had been chosen specifically for its isolation and the ease with which bodies could be buried in the soft sand. The irony that families had vacationed and played just yards from a mass grave site added another layer of horror to the discoveries. Media coverage of the excavations created a circus atmosphere that complicated the investigation while satisfying public demand for information about the unfolding horror. Television crews camped outside each burial site, broadcasting live updates as body after body was uncovered. Newspaper headlines grew increasingly sensational as the body count mounted, with reporters struggling to find adequate language to describe the scope of Corll's crimes. The identification process proved to be one of the most challenging aspects of the investigation. Many of the victims had been missing for months or years, and decomposition had made visual identification impossible in most cases. Forensic experts relied on dental records, medical devices, and personal effects to match remains with missing persons reports that had been gathering dust in police files. As identifications were confirmed, investigators faced the heartbreaking task of notifying families who had spent years hoping for their children's safe return. Parents who had been told their sons were runaways suddenly learned they had been victims of torture and murder, their bodies buried in mass graves while police refused to investigate their disappearances. The emotional toll on these families was compounded by their growing realization that their children might have been saved if authorities had taken their initial reports seriously. The investigation also revealed the true scope of law enforcement's failure to recognize the pattern of disappearances that had been developing since 1970. Missing persons files that had been closed after cursory investigations were reopened, revealing connections and similarities that should have been obvious to any detective conducting meaningful analysis of the cases. By the end of August 1973, investigators had recovered 27 bodies from the 3 primary burial sites, though Henley insisted the total number of victims was higher. The search for additional burial locations would continue for months, driven by tips from the public and Henley's fragmentary memories of disposal sites that Corll had used during their partnership. The trials of Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks began in the summer of 1974, nearly a year after the horrific discoveries that had shocked Houston and captured national attention. What should have been straightforward prosecutions of accomplices to mass murder instead became complex legal battles that raised disturbing questions about justice, complicity, and the failure of multiple institutions to protect Houston's most vulnerable children. Henley's trial, which began first due to his role in Corll's death, presented prosecutors with an unusual challenge. While the physical evidence clearly established that Dean Corll had committed at least 27 murders, proving Henley's level of culpability required reconstructing a relationship dynamic that defied easy categorization. Was he a willing accomplice who had participated enthusiastically in the killings, or was he himself a victim of Corll's manipulation who had been coerced into participation through fear and psychological control? The prosecution, led by Harris County District Attorney Carol Vance, argued that Henley had been a full partner in the murder conspiracy, motivated by financial gain and sadistic pleasure. They presented evidence of his recruitment activities, his presence during multiple murders, and his assistance in disposing of bodies. Most damaging was testimony about the payments he had received, $200 for each victim he successfully delivered to Corll, which established a clear commercial motive for his actions. Henley's defense team, recognizing the overwhelming evidence against their client, pursued a strategy that emphasized his youth and the psychological manipulation he had endured. They argued that Corll had systematically groomed Henley from the age of 15, using a combination of financial dependency, drug addiction, and terror to ensure compliance. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological effects of prolonged abuse and the ways in which victims can be transformed into perpetrators through careful manipulation. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Henley himself took the witness stand, providing graphic testimony about his relationship with Corll and his participation in the murders. His account painted a picture of a teenager trapped in a nightmare from which escape seemed impossible, bound to his tormentor by fear, dependency, and his own growing complicity in unspeakable crimes. Henley described the internal conflict he experienced as he lured friends to their deaths, claiming that he had convinced himself he was saving them from worse fates at the hands of other predators. He spoke of his attempts to distance himself from the actual killings, trying to maintain the fiction that he was merely a recruiter rather than a participant in murder. Most chilling was his description of the gradual normalization of violence, the way systematic exposure to horror had numbed his emotional responses and moral judgment. The jury, faced with the difficult task of determining appropriate punishment for crimes that had no precedent in Texas legal history, deliberated for hours before returning a verdict of guilty on multiple counts of murder. Henley was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year terms, ensuring he would never be eligible for parole. The sentence reflected both the severity of his crimes and society's need to impose some form of justice on horror that seemed to defy human comprehension. David Brooks's trial, which followed several months later, followed a similar pattern but with even less sympathy for the defendant. Brooks's longer involvement with Corll, his presence during more murders, and his apparent lack of remorse made him a less sympathetic figure than Henley. His defense attorneys struggled to present mitigating evidence, as Brooks himself seemed unable to articulate any explanation for his actions beyond simple compliance with Corll's demands. Brooks was also convicted on multiple murder charges and sentenced to life imprisonment, though legal technicalities would eventually result in his serving far less time than Henley. The disparity in their sentences sparked controversy among victims' families, who argued that both accomplices deserved equal punishment for their roles in the conspiracy. But even as the legal system processed the individual cases of Henley and Brooks, larger questions about institutional failure remained largely unaddressed. The Houston Police Department conducted an internal review of their handling of missing persons cases, but the investigation was perfunctory and resulted in no significant policy changes or disciplinary actions. Officers who had consistently dismissed missing persons reports as runaways faced no consequences for their negligence. The failure to hold law enforcement accountable became a source of additional anguish for victims' families, who realized that their children's deaths might have been prevented if police had taken their initial reports seriously. Parents who had been told their sons were runaways filed lawsuits against the city, seeking both financial compensation and acknowledgement of official negligence. Most of these cases were settled out of court, with confidentiality agreements that prevented public discussion of the settlements. Perhaps most troubling was the revelation that additional victims likely remained undiscovered. Henley had consistently claimed that the total number of murders exceeded the 27 bodies that had been recovered, suggesting that Corll had used burial sites that were never identified. Despite extensive searches and follow-up investigations, these additional victims were never found, leaving their families without closure and justice incomplete. The Icebox murders case officially closed in 1975, but its impact on Houston and American criminal justice extended far beyond the legal proceedings. The case exposed systemic failures in missing persons investigations, revealed the vulnerability of society's most marginal children, and demonstrated how easily monsters could operate in plain sight when institutions failed to fulfill their protective responsibilities. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.